There is a certain kind of person who grew up being called the reliable one. While siblings played, they checked on the parent. While others forgot homework, they remembered everything. They were the one adults leaned on before they were old enough to understand what leaning even meant. They became the family's quiet backbone. The one who held things together with both hands while no one noticed the weight. They learned to read the room before they could read a book. To manage chaos before they ever managed their own emotions. They were the child who stopped being a child far too soon. But if you know someone like this, or if you are someone like this, understand something profound. The responsibility was never evenly chosen. It was handed to them by a system that needed someone steady, and they were simply the one who showed up and never stopped showing up. Today we are going to decode the psychology of people who were always the responsible sibling. Why their brain developed this way. How it follows them into every relationship and every room they enter as adults. And what they can finally do to set down a burden that was never entirely theirs to carry. So why does this happen? Why do some children become the anchor while others drift freely? The answer splits into two distinct psychological rivers. One flows from biology. One flows from necessity. But both arrive at the same destination. A child shaped by responsibility before they ever had the chance to simply be. The first group is born with a nervous system that is simply more attuned. These are highly sensitive persons, carrying the trait scientists call sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS. Their brains register emotional shifts faster. They feel the family's tension like a weather change in the body. Their nervous system volunteers them for emotional labor without anyone asking. The second group was built by circumstance. Imagine a home where one parent was absent, unpredictable, or struggling. Someone had to manage the younger siblings at dinner. Someone had to translate the parents' moods into something the little ones could survive. That child did not choose responsibility. Responsibility chose them, quietly, one small crisis at a time. In both cases, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, learned to stay switched on. A chaotic home trained it to treat unpredictability as danger. Cortisol, the stress hormone, became a steady background hum. The brain wired itself around vigilance. Around anticipating what was needed before anyone voiced it. Around being useful as a form of being safe. Slowly, helpfulness became identity. Being the responsible one stopped being a role and became a self-concept. They did not think of it as sacrifice. They thought of it as simply who they were. The caretaker. The dependable one. The one you call when everything falls apart. And they answered every single time. So when this enters adult life, it does not arrive as a memory or a wound they can point to. It arrives as an invisible job description they carry everywhere. A reflex. A posture. A quiet exhaustion that seems to have no source because the source was buried decades ago beneath someone else's need. The first sign is an almost compulsive need to be the most prepared person in any room. They do not show up ready. They show up overprepared, backup plans for the backup plans, having already thought through every scenario 3 days in advance. Rest feels like negligence. Preparedness feels like the only form of safety they trust. At work, while everyone else wings the presentation, they have rehearsed it 4 times and printed 3 extra copies. Before a vacation, they have researched hospitals in the destination city. Before a dinner party, they have memorized dietary restrictions no one told them but that they assumed and quietly accommodated without announcement or credit. This lives in the default mode network, or DMN, the brain simulation engine. In healthy use, the DMN helps plan and imagine. In the responsible sibling, the DMN runs catastrophe rehearsals on a permanent loop. It was trained in a childhood where being unprepared meant someone younger got hurt or something fragile got broken. The emotional consequence is a deep inability to rest. Their body sits on the sofa, but the brain is already at tomorrow's meeting. Already anticipating next week's problem. Relaxation never fully arrives because the nervous system learned long ago that peace was the moment right before something went wrong and they had missed the warning. This exhausting preparation bleeds seamlessly into the next sign, which is even more invisible but just as deeply carved. The second sign is emotional hypervigilance, so constant it has become background noise they no longer even notice. They read the emotional temperature of every room they enter like a trained meteorologist reads the sky. A shift in tone, a pause that lasts a beat too long, and they have already recalibrated their entire behavior to manage the weather before it becomes a storm. At family gatherings, while everyone else eats and laughs, they watch. They notice their mother's jaw tighten when a certain topic is raised. They feel their siblings' mood shift before a word is spoken. And before anyone else registers that tension has entered the room, they have already moved to diffuse it, lighten it, redirect it. This is hypervigilance operating through mirror neurons, the brain cells that simulate other people's emotional states inside your own body. In the responsible sibling, mirror neurons were trained to run continuously. Feeling what others feel was not optional. It was the early warning system that helped them keep the household from tipping. The consequence is a life where other people's emotional states feel louder than their own. They walk through the world perpetually tuned to a frequency that is not their own. And because they spend so much energy sensing outward, they often become strangers to their own inner landscape. They know everyone else's pain before they know their own hunger. This disconnection from self creates the next sign, one that follows them into every relationship they try to build as adults. The third sign is guilt that activates the moment they prioritize themselves. Not mild discomfort. Real guilt. The kind that feels like a betrayal of something sacred. They book a solo trip and immediately wonder who will handle things while they are gone. They say no to a request and spend the afternoon convinced they have abandoned someone. A friend invites them to 2 events on the same weekend. They choose the one they actually want. Within an hour, they are texting apologies, offering to make it up, constructing elaborate justifications for why they deserved to want something. Wanting something purely for themselves still registers internally as suspicious, even dangerous. The insular cortex, which governs interoception, the brain's ability to sense and honor its own internal signals, was systematically deprioritized during their formation years. Their developing brain learned that self-focus was a luxury the family system could not afford. That lesson became biology. Now self-care does not feel like rest. It feels like dereliction. The emotional consequence is a life spent waiting for permission to exist fully. They are generous with everyone and stingy with themselves. They give freely and receive awkwardly, sometimes with a flash of shame, as though receiving without immediately giving something back is a moral failure they have not yet earned forgiveness for. And that pattern of self-erasure quietly opens the door to the next sign, one that quietly devastates their closest relationships. The fourth sign is deep resentment that they cannot fully explain or comfortably express. They help constantly. They give generously. They show up reliably. But somewhere beneath the capable exterior, a slow fire burns. No one asks how they are doing. No one checks whether they are okay. No one wonders who takes care of the one who takes care of everyone. A sibling calls only when there is a problem. A partner assumes the logistics will be handled. A friend leans without ever asking what the weight feels like from this side. And they absorb it all. They do not say anything. But at some point, alone, brushing their teeth before bed, something surfaces that they cannot quite name. It is not anger. It is grief. This is cognitive empathy, the brain's capacity to understand others' perspectives, creating an imbalance. They extend it outward with extraordinary skill. But no one in the original family system modeled returning it. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation and perspective-taking, was trained in a one-directional system. Empathy flowed out, rarely in. The emotional consequence is a loneliness that coexists with constant company. They are surrounded by people who depend on them. But dependence is not intimacy. Being needed is not the same as being known. And the hunger underneath the resentment is simply this. They want someone to carry something for them, just once, without being asked. This unexpressed grief connects to the final sign, perhaps the most quietly heartbreaking of all. The fifth sign is an identity so fused with being needed that they genuinely do not know who they are when no one requires anything from them. When the house is quiet. When the tasks are done. When no one is in crisis. They sit with themselves and feel a strange emptiness, not peace. As though stillness itself is a question they have never been given the tools to answer. They finish a demanding project at work and feel relief for one day before the anxiety of purposelessness creeps in. They help a friend through a breakup and feel most alive in those moments of being essential. Holidays without a role to play feel oddly unmooring. Somewhere along the way, the responsible sibling outsourced their sense of self to the concept of usefulness. This is the default mode network colliding with analysis paralysis. When the brain has no external problem to solve, no one to manage, no crisis to navigate, it turns inward and finds uncertainty. Who am I outside of what I do for others? The question is not philosophical. It feels existential. Because their identity was built almost entirely in relation to others' needs. The emotional consequence is a quiet terror of unstructured freedom. Vacations feel oddly hollow. Retirement terrifies them. An ordinary quiet Tuesday with no obligations can feel stranger than any emergency. The responsible sibling mastered presence in service. But presence simply for themselves, with no task attached, is the one skill they were never taught and never given room to practice. Every single one of these signs grew from the same root. A child who loved their family so much they sacrificed their own, becoming to hold everyone else's together. And here is what most people never stop to realize. The responsible sibling did not just take on tasks. They took on an entire emotional architecture. They became the family's nervous system. The one who regulated everyone else's chaos so the others could afford the luxury of falling apart. That is not just responsibility. That is extraordinary love given far too early to someone far too young. So what can they do? They cannot simply decide to stop being responsible. They cannot meditate their way out of a pattern that was carved into their nervous system before they had language for it. Real healing is not about doing less. It is about finally asking a question they were never allowed to ask. What do I need? The path forward lives in 3 principles that reach the actual root. The first is learning to receive without immediately reciprocating. The second is practicing the discipline of intentional uselessness, doing something with no productive output and staying with the discomfort that follows. The third is separating identity from function, learning to exist as a person, not just a role. The first principle begins with something small. Someone compliments their work. Instead of deflecting or immediately returning the compliment, they simply say thank you and let it land. Someone offers to help. They say yes and do not apologize for needing it. Research on self-compassion shows that receiving care activates the same neural reward circuits as giving it. The brain can learn this new direction. The second principle asks them to schedule deliberate purposelessness. 20 minutes of sitting in a park with no phone, no list, no one to check on. The anxiety that rises is the nervous system asking what the threat is. The answer they practice giving is there is no threat. This is allowed. This is mine. Over time, the prefrontal cortex recalibrates what safety means. The third principle is the most profound. They begin asking themselves one question before every act of helping. Am I doing this because I want to, or because I am afraid of what happens if I do not? The answer is rarely immediate. But the practice of asking builds metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe their own thinking, until the difference between choice and reflex becomes clear. When they practice this letting go of the appointed role, something quietly extraordinary happens. They discover that the people who truly love them do not need them to be useful. They find that rest does not destroy the world. They begin to receive care without flinching. They begin to exist in the full breadth of who they are, not just the narrow corridor of who they were needed to be. They stop being the load-bearing wall that holds the whole structure up alone. And slowly, warmly, they become something else entirely. A person who gives from fullness rather than fear. A candle that burns not because someone needs the light, but because the light is genuinely, finally, beautifully their own. These are people who think deeply, love fiercely, and carry more than anyone sees. Their reliability is not a flaw. Their care is not a weakness. The only shift required is learning that they were always worthy of the same tender attention they gave to everyone else, not because they earned it, but because they simply are. If this feels familiar, leave a comment below and tell me which sign fits you most. The relentless preparation. The hypervigilance. The guilt around self-care. The unexplained resentment. Or the emptiness when no one needs anything? Your answer is not a diagnosis. It is a recognition. And recognition is always where healing begins. If this video helped you feel even slightly less alone in the story you have been carrying, please press like and share it with someone who spent their childhood being far too responsible for their age. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to subscribe, because every week we go deep into the psychology of being human, together.